So last week I did a video on an AMD FX 3850. Picked it up, a bit of a bargain of miscellaneous. I don't know whether they're working parts from Facebook. I did have a problem with it. So I've added RAM and a graphics card, a 7850, and then I did some benchmarks. But one of the problems we noticed with it was while we had bent pins on the processor and the disk wasn't performing as it should. Now I couldn't work out because of a problem with the motherboard or the pins or a combination of issues, including the actual SSD from Lighton, whether that was the problem. But what we kept on getting was mixed speeds from sort of really low 45 megs to 480 to 650 on the internet. So you can see in the video here of my AMD R7 AM4 running at a higher speed than the 970, but they're both supposed to be sat at 6 gigs per second, and as you can see the processor was fine. When I took it out there was no bent pins because I was worried whether one may have bent completely because the socket was caked with cooling compound that had gone really hard. It looks like, well, the processor wasn't in the socket. If you watch the first video, at the end I put a picture up of the actual image. So we had a couple of bent pins, and along the top of this had cooling compound across the top there. I'm looking on the video here so I can keep relevant to the video, and what happened was it coated across and actually filled up the holes, and there was a couple of other little ones on there as well. So afterwards gave it a good clean, but there was a difference. What had actually happened was there was not much of a performance difference initially dealing with the socket there. Jetted it out with cleaning, contact cleaner, and what we did then was bench it again. Now it transpires that it was probably a BIOS fault, a really badly designed BIOS, and it was the difference between the configuration for the RAID setup in the RAID controller side of it as the difference between the write cache and caching, which gave me a very high write speed and a very low read speed, which is not something that you really want on a work game station. So we benchmarked it again. Obviously I didn't do this benchmark in the first video, but I did it in this one, and we can compare that to the other processors getting round about the same score. And as you can see, we've got 4 77Ks at 4.6 gigs, down to a i7 950 at 4.2 and a 4.4, but all had a 980 Ti graphics card, which is way more powerful than the graphics card that we actually put in. Again, I ran the standard 3D Mark Advantage benchmark. Unfortunately, I was hoping that we could actually see the frames per second, but that didn't actually transpire out very well on there. It's very out of focus, but the frames were a little bit better, and what you'll see later on is that they are a lot better, but we get a deficit on the CPU. Now this comes with loading. If you had, well, back in the day you would have your CPU, your sound card, and that would take off the load from the onboard, which went through the onboard chipset, which would slow things down generally. So what we did on this one was actually push up the performance and lose it in other areas, which is a bit of a bizarre one, but it's what happens. So yeah, the graphics performance was normally bad, and what I'm going to do is just keep quiet for a little while when we get down to the results, which I can see in my timeline here are coming up shortly. I should say really that Warzone performance was actually worse. So we're just about now to come on to the benchmark scores. Now I've put the frames per second together, but just take a look at the CPU results. So we've got a 23275 on the one current one, and we got a 22672. So we've got almost 1,000 points difference, we'll say. But if you look at the frame rates on this, you can see that before we're getting roughly about 10 frames in some of these different. So overall we'll say it's about an 8 frames per second difference, but that can be down to the memory timings, CPU clock, and just general. It's a general thing. If you benchmark a system more than once or twice over a period, you'll notice that you get quite a few differences. Time spike was an absolute nightmare. It was about 8 to 9 frames per second with the wind behind it. So as you can see, there is some real bad juddering in this benchmark. And I think we got a figure with displaying the frames on here coming up shortly, and you'll see that it's 8 or 18 maybe. So it wasn't really good. There you go, 18 frames per second. This is more a CPU test than a GPU test, but it didn't do well in this benchmark at all. In fact, my Ryzen 7 is so much more better and more fluid in this than this juddering mess, especially because we're running at a high DPI, low resolution. So I've got more dots in an inch than a standard one. But I thought it was quite funny that it came up as a 1600, but the best is 1735. Now this is the original benchmark from Guru 3D. So let's look at the games. So on Apex Legend I got some peaks around 120, but we were averaging sort of 80-ish frames to 120 frames, and overall it came out as about 121 frames per second according to the MSI and Reva results. So it's not too bad. The gameplay was fluid. You wouldn't notice, I don't notice playing over my new system over this system, which is what, 10 years old. So gameplay was easy enough, although playing on such a small monitor, and I don't know whether you've seen this, but there's my normal monitor and there's the other monitor that we were playing on. Now this is a native 720 monitor I picked up quite some time ago, and it's new old stock. It's sat in its box for ages, and when I bought it originally, I'd bought it to one of my other monitors, my Samsung's, had broke, so it stood in its place while I got all the parts to repair it, fixed that and used that monitor, which was quite small compared to my actual monitors, but when I upgraded, obviously I went to a larger screen. So I can see everything on here, everything's so tiny, and I'm actually further away from it, so it makes gameplay that much more difficult. Although we do get some kills on here. I've edited it through. Yeah, so yeah, it was really difficult seeing people on here playing on such small screens in such small resolution. In fact, this actual screen, the small screen, is I think it's something like a 19-inch, but it's a 16 by 9. But it's almost quarter the size of my other screen. It would be ideal to plug it into a HD TV, 42-inch or something like that, and it would probably be a lot more playable than trying to play on this. And this video camera is actually adapting, so you're getting more of a colour range and depth of colour from the video camera than the actual gameplay. So it's not an accurate description, and it's quite blurry because it just tends to want to focus all over the place, and if you look up at the squad, you'll see it goes in and out of focus with the camera. That's why we like modern tech. So there's the frame rates on the screen, they're the actual and what the Catalyst was reporting, because oddly enough the Catalyst reported Fortnite at 53 frames and it was locked at 60 and was constantly playing at 60 frames per second, although sometimes with the lobby ones I usually reduce the frame rate because there's no point and it lets the system run that much cooler. So in conclusion, is it a good decent CPU? Well, apart from the data rates across the drive, the performance of the system overall, we've got rid of all the stutters out of it now. It's running perfectly fine. Yeah, it's contemporary. I haven't done any video editing on it. I wanted to run some through it just to see what it's actually like. It may actually prove to be quite a good performer, but gaming wise there's no reason why shoving a decent graphics card in there wouldn't give you a modern day AAA title gaming system, although it is a bit power hungry. Although saying that, it's got 127 TDP. My Ryzen 7 is apparently, I don't know, let's say 80, but it goes up to about 160 quite easily. So yeah, so you might as well just ignore most of that on there. It's nice and quiet, actually. It's quieter than my Ryzen 7. I do get a lot of fan noise from my Ryzen, trying to keep the VRMs quite cool on there. The CPU temperature never really went above 55 degrees. The VRMs were around 70, 80 degrees, things that a lot of people have said. It does perform a bit of a mixed bag with different apps, and it does perform. It does work like most modern CPUs, and so technically it's ahead of its time. I would going to go through and do a Cinebench on it again, and I'll slap the results up on the video just so you can get some R15 results to do a comparison, because I like using the same comparisons across all the CPUs. Now you probably did notice we had a small clock on here, pushing up to about 4.3 gigahertz. It will go up to 4.5 relatively easy. I haven't bothered overclocking it in any detail whatsoever. But the BIOS on this BioStar board isn't very good, as we've already seen with the data flow rates. Up to the storage weren't particularly brilliant and were all over the place, to say the least. But we now have a pretty good repeatable benchmark performance score from this, with the correcting of the BIOS, and that was to reset the BIOS RAID controller via the BIOS, reboot and set it and reboot again and then reset it, and all was well. So we don't know whether it's just going to be that or the pin issue. The pins that were covered in cooling compound were the data pins for the drives anyway, so it would have caused some sort of issue anyway. But we cleaned it out, we got it done, and as you can see there was quite a lot. I think I cleaned it out, there was another 3 cotton buds on there of covered in grey compound, and what we did was actually be able to wash it through the base. There's a gap at the top left and the middle bottom, which let the fluid wash out the cooling compound from the socket. So we got there in the end. But yeah, it's actually quite a decent system. Gets a recommendation. Whether it's better than the i5, I don't really know. I used the i5 for two years or so, but according to some of the benchmarks there, it's closer to an i7 44 whatever K. So yeah, it can't be too bad. Thanks for watching.